Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on peace journalism. It is part of a series of webinars looking at countering polarization, the challenges facing media and communication around the world. We are choosing this particular theme, peace journalism, because of course it is particularly relevant now. Not that it is ever not relevant at any one point in time. There's always a hot conflict going on in some part of the world, which poses special challenges for the media. And even, of course, if we are lucky to be in a place like Hong Kong that is currently not facing violent conflict, it is, of course, the duty of citizens and journalists to write about and share information in a way that does not actually make the situation worse. And this is why this theme, of course, is of global relevance. To discuss it, we're extremely fortunate to have with us someone who has been thinking about this issue for a long time, as well as thinking about how to do journalism better, and teaching about it as well. Stephen Youngblood is the founding director of the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University in Parkville, Missouri. He has organized and taught peace journalism seminars and workshops around the world, I guess in probably every continent. When I first contacted him, he was in Nepal. Right now, he's in Moldova, and I'm sure there are many other places in the world that would value his insights into how journalism can be done better when reporting conflict. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. I know what it means when you say I've been studying it a long time. It's a very polite way of saying I'm old. Well, I am old, and I'm also the director of the Center for Global Peace Journalism. As mentioned, I am, among these duties, I've taught peace journalism in 33 different countries. I also publish something called the Peace Journalist Magazine, which is available online. If you just Google Peace Journalist Magazine, you can get the most recent issue and the back issues as well. I'm currently in Moldova, where I'm teaching on a Fulbright scholarship this academic year. So I'm teaching at the State University, working with the Youth Media Center, and doing other projects here where I'm collaborating with journalism colleagues. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about peace journalism in times of war specifically. I'll give an overview about what peace journalism is. Then we'll talk a little bit about its applicability in situations of war. Specifically, we'll concentrate on Gaza, but certainly what we talk about with Gaza is going to be appropriate when we discuss, appropriate for analyzing Ukraine as well. I'll leave at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for your questions, for your comments, and so on. So the concept of peace journalism was first developed in the 1960s by a Norwegian academic named Dr. Johan Galtung. And actually, very sadly, Dr. Galtung just passed away about a week ago. He was 93 years old. So Dr. Galtung and his colleagues in the 1960s looked around at journalism and didn't like what they saw. They saw journalism that oftentimes did more to fuel conflict than to mitigate conflict. So Dr. Galtung and his colleagues came up with this concept of peace journalism, which has subsequently been developed by Professor Jake Lynch, who you may have heard of. And then I've done a little work in this area as well. So you see a couple of definitions of peace journalism on your screen. The first definition from Professor Lynch and his partner Annabelle McGoldrick, talking about giving an opportunity for society to consider and value nonviolent responses to conflict. Another way of looking at it, the bottom definition, is when reporters and editors are making choices that improve the prospects for peace. These choices include how we frame our stories, the way we tell the stories. These choices include the words that we use. So are these words inflammatory? Are they demonizing? The choices include the images that we use as well, both video and still images. So peace journalism can do these things without compromising the principles of good journalism. It's equally important to think about what peace journalism is not. So peace journalism is not open advocacy for peace. So we're not saying there must be peace. What we are doing is giving a voice to peacemakers, a proportionate voice to peacemakers, giving a voice to those who have traditionally been marginalized, and framing our stories in a different way. But we're not openly advocating for peace. We're simply discussing peace. We're putting peace on the table, as it were, on the agenda. What peace journalism also is not, it's not good news journalism. So if something terrible happens, we have to report it. So if a bomb goes off and people die, we have to report that. A journalist would never ignore that. So peace journalism very seldom, peace journalism doesn't ask, do we report it? Peace journalism asks, how do we report it? Can we report this bombing in such a way that at minimum, it doesn't make a bad situation worse? So sometimes that's the best that we can do as peace journalists, is just to not make the situation worse, to not put petrol on the fire. And if we can do that, then we're doing something that's a lot better than majority traditional journalism. So what are the characteristics of peace journalism? Let's take a minute and talk about those. So first of all, peace journalism is proactive, looking at conflicts before they occur and discussing solutions. So you may have heard about solutions journalism, and any peace journalist would tell you that we're all for discussing solutions. You may have heard of the Solutions Journalism Network. We support their work as well. But I would tell them, Dr. Galtung was talking about solutions 50 years before there was a Solutions Journalism Network. So the discussion of solutions has always been a part of peace journalism. And it's discussing solutions without advocating for any one solution. Secondly, peace journalism rejects us versus them. So traditional journalism puts one group against another group. So in the US, it might be black versus white. It might be MAGA, Trump, Republicans versus others. Here in Moldova, it would be Russian speakers versus Romanian speakers, Russian supporters versus Ukraine supporters. But regardless of where we are, it's these us versus them models, the research shows, predominate. Peace journalism instead looks to build bridges across boundaries. So a really good example, I've been working for, I don't know, the last 3 years, maybe 4, on a project from the East-West Center, which is a State Department grantee that's based in Hawaii. And what this project has done has brought together Indian and Pakistani journalists. So the first group was 80, the second group was 20. So what we've done with these journalists is we've brought them together and put them into reporting teams to report issues of common interest or concern. Just about 6 weeks ago, at the beginning of this year, I was in Nepal meeting these journalists and talking about peace journalism and how they can bring together their stories in a way that helps to build bridges between two countries that are quote unquote enemies. So there's this website that they've established called Journalists for Change. So you can Google that too. And on it are all sorts of stories that the journalists themselves have done as teams, one Indian and one Pakistani. And they run the gamut of all different sorts of subjects, from stories about gender balance, to stories about the economy, to stories about agriculture. This last group that we worked with in January concentrated on environmental stories. So they're looking at various environmental issues, for example, flooding, and looking at them from both Indian and Pakistani perspectives. So this is what we mean by building bridges. In fact, I'll be working on a project here in Moldova that builds bridges between two regions of Moldova, between the country of Moldova and a breakaway republic called Transnistria. That's a very long story. You can look that up. Thirdly, peace journalism rejects propaganda. Simple enough, regardless of the source. Peace journalism illuminates and embraces complexity. One way to know that information is bad, that information is corrupt, that information may be propaganda, is if they take a very simple, they take an issue that's extremely complex and present it in very simplistic terms. Present it us versus them, good versus bad, black versus white, when we know that in life, most of life isn't in the black or in the white, but it's the gray area in between. Fifthly, peace journalism gives a voice to the voiceless. So what do I mean by that? So in all societies, I need to redo that. So in all societies, there are people who we would consider voiceless, people who live on the margins of society. So maybe they're poor, maybe they live in rural areas, maybe they're a minority. Regardless, whoever these people are, peace journalism seeks to give them a voice. Here's a really good example. A colleague of mine at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, took her students to the Arctic Circle, 1,000 miles north of Montreal, to do a Voice of the Voiceless story with Native Americans who live in that region. So we used to use the term Eskimo to refer to these people, but it's not a term that they want us to use, so we don't. So what they did, this team of student journalists did, was they went to Canada and they, using the voices of the natives, recorded a documentary about this area and about their project to become a clean energy community. This is told in their own voices, in their own language. I just want to show you a minute or two of this. And this documentary, by the way, aired on CTV, Canadian National Television. So it's been widely seen throughout Canada.
Salumay tweet ukswalo tutut ikmalioti ikumatit sibut ikumani ukkoyo tsisutilu illuyuatini kisiani ukswalok salumay litiriyok anernisarmi sirmimik imarmilo tamannanok kahulak tavut tamannalo asi itulangalaksu
Over here we have our 500-gallon tank, which heats our homes. Sometimes we run out of fuel. We don't have any heat in our homes sometimes for a day or two. Even if there's a small spill, you can smell it in the whole, in the whole house. So even inside in the house, sometimes there's fuel spills and there's leaks. Sometimes the tanks are so old that they start to rust, and they start to have leaks around these places.
Okay, so we see an example of giving a voice to the marginalized in our societies. Here in Moldova, the most marginalized community are Roma. And so, in fact, I'm working on a project that will seek to build bridges between Roma journalists and Moldovan journalists. So this idea about bridge building, I think, is a very key, this idea about giving a voice to the voiceless, like the Roma, is a really important key to peace journalism, I think. So peace journalists can offer depth and context in the reporting that we do. So rather than just superficial coverage of issues, we're really looking behind the scenes at the why. So during the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, for example, I think the media did a pretty good job of covering the protests themselves, covering the arrests, the unrest, and so on. I think they did a poor job of providing the depth and the context. So why is all this occurring? And the answer is it's a lot more than just George Floyd. What happened to George Floyd, right? So it's hundreds of years of oppression of African Americans that's behind this. Peace journalists consider the consequences of our reporting. So if we report this story in this way, what happens? Are we putting petrol on the fire? Peace journalists are very careful about the words we select. So are these words sensational? Are we saying 20 people were slaughtered in a bloody, brutal massacre? Or are we saying 20 people were killed? Do the words that we use pour gasoline on the fire? Are the words demonizing? Do we use stereotyping and demonizing language? Okay, to create an enemy. Do we use victimizing language? So all the language that we use, we need to be very careful because we know that words can be very powerful. The same applies to images. We'll look at some examples from the Israel-Hamas war in a minute. But image selection is very important as well. Do we need to show bloody images? Do we need to show children? We can discuss that. There's no right or wrong necessarily, but are those kinds of images really needed to tell the story? And finally, number 10, peace journalism offers counter narratives that debunk media-created and perpetuated stereotypes, myths, and misperceptions. Example. I did a refugee reporting project in Turkey. And so working with Turkish journalists to tell counter narratives about refugees. So the narrative in Turkey is that the refugees, well, the narrative is negative, that the refugees are a burden, that they're criminals, that they're diseased, and so on. So with the journalists I was training, we went into a refugee camp, a huge camp, 20,000 people. And I charged my journalists with finding and telling a counter-narrative story. Here's the story that one of them came up with. It's a story about a business inside the refugee camp. That business was a wedding store. So imagine that. something you don't think of in a refugee camp, a counter narrative, a wedding store, a store that has tuxedos and wedding gowns and flowers and food, and you can get a band, everything you need for a marriage. And you think, that's not what you think of when you think of a refugee camp. But people are in refugee camps for years. And you know, boy meets girl, they fall in love and they want to get married, whether they're in a camp or not in a camp. So I think that's an interesting example of a counter narrative. So at this point, now that you know a little bit about what peace journalism is, I want to put you to the test. So on the screen is a story. What I want you to do is to read this story and to be ready to answer the question, is this peace journalism? And if it's not peace journalism, why is it not peace journalism? All right? So I'll read this with you because some of you may be a distance from the screen. And then either in the chat or you can just speak up, tell me why this is or isn't peace journalism. Peace talks aimed at ending the conflict in Macedonia lay in ruins last night after the massacre of 8 policemen by Albanian rebels who mutilated the bodies. The atrocity took place at the mountain village of 𝗪𝗪𝗪, where a police patrol was attacked with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. 6 other men were wounded and 3 vehicles destroyed. The bodies were cut with knives after they died, he said, and 1 man's head was smashed in. The attack was believed to be the work of the National Liberal Army terrorists from the hills near Tetovo. Ali Ahmedi, a political leader of the NLA, said that his men may have fired in self-defense. So, is this peace journalism? I think we would agree that it's not. So my question to you, as I say, either speak up or put it in the chat, is why is this not peace journalism?
We have a member of the class who will answer.
Excellent.
Because I've stuck the mic into her face.
Excellent.
Hello, my name is Rosella. I think it is not a piece of peace journalism, might be because of some words used in the passage. I'm not very familiar with it, but maybe it's about the sentence of the second paragraph. The bodies were cut with knives after they died, he said, and 1 man's head had been mashed in. I'm not sure whether this kind of wordings will affect the nature of the passage, whether it is not belongs to peace journalism or not. And that's my thought.
Thank you. That's a really terrific analysis. Anyone else?
Cool.
Hi, my name is Karen. I think it's not a peace journalism article because, as you said, voice is not given to the voiceless people. It's only about the person who is engaged into this massacre.
That's excellent. So you are both entirely correct. So look at the language, first of all. Atrocity, massacre, terrorist. These are sensational and demonizing words, aren't they? So certainly that alone makes it not peace journalism. All the detail about the head smashed in, that seems a little sensational to me as well and not really necessary. Look at the first sentence. Peace talks aimed at ending the conflict in Macedonia lay in ruins. So stop and think about what that means. That peace talks are no more. That peace, it's saying peace is not possible. And if peace is not possible, then what comes next? What's the only alternative? And the answer is war, right? So look at the balance or the lack of balance in the story. So it's basically government propaganda. with a little quote at the bottom from 𝗬𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗏. Okay, let's look at...
I wonder if I could just chip in and say that I mean, of course, it is possible that the peace talks might be damaged, but it's highly unlikely that within so few hours, the journalists conclude that, because this just happened last night, right? Lay in ruins last night after the massacre. How in the world do the journalists come to the conclusion that the peace talks are in ruins so soon after the massacre? I mean, did they really go and interview the peacemakers on both sides? This is the conclusion they came to. Unlikely. It's unlikely that they've actually talked to all the people that could be trying to make peace and come to that conclusion. So it seems highly subjective.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Well, let's look at the same story framed a little differently as peace journalism. There was condemnation across the political spectrum in Macedonia after a police patrol suffered the loss of 8 men. Both the main parties representing the country's minority Albanians distanced themselves from the killings, believed to be the work of the self-styled National Liberation Army. 𝗬𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃, a political leader of the NLA, denied that his men had attacked the patrol, saying they may have fired in self-defense. But the Macedonian government said it had done nothing to provoke the machine gun fire and rocket-propelled grenades, which destroyed 3 trucks. A spokesman added that the bodies appeared to have been disfigured. So look at what's in this story. And the answer is the information about what happened is here. So peace journalism is not, this story is not ignoring what happened. But gone is the accusatory, sensational language, right? The story attempted a little more balance. So 𝗬𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃 is a little higher up in the story. The gory details about the head smashed in have been replaced by the simple statement that the bodies were disfigured. So this is a better story. An even better story, as your professor mentioned, would include a longer, more detailed story, would include interviews from peacemakers on all sides and a thorough, detailed analysis on how this affects peace. So thank you for that very interesting discussion. So in the few minutes that we have left, well, let me say this. So peace journalism, we've discovered, we being proponents, writers, professors, and so on, that peace journalism is applicable to many different types of reporting. So I've given entire workshops in peace journalism and refugee reporting, peace journalism and electoral reporting. There are chapters in my book about peace journalism and terrorism, peace journalism and race. It so happens that peace journalism was first developed as an antidote to poor war reporting. And so for the next few minutes, let's look at these principles that we've discussed and discuss how they might apply in situations where there's an active war. So about a month ago, I did a workshop for the International Center for Journalists, and they wanted my analysis of coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. And my response was, it's too early to do any analysis of this. Even now, with the war just a few months old, it's hard to get any perspective. So rather than attempt some sort of study at this point, what I've done is come up with some questions that we might ask ourselves about the coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. Now, these same questions could be asked about the Ukraine war as well. In fact, here in Moldova, since Ukraine is a next door neighbor, the Ukraine war is a much more prominent subject, right? Not that there's not coverage of Israel, but certainly the Ukraine war is on everyone's mind here in Moldova. So I think these questions could be applicable to any conflict. First of all, Does the coverage present all survivors as worthy? So my anecdotal take on this is that you see a lot of Western coverage that presents Israeli victims and survivors one way, and coverage from the Arab world that presents them much differently, right? So true peace journalism coverage of this would present all victims and survivors as worthy. Do the stories accurately portray suffering on all sides? It's the same thing, right? So are we seeing in Israeli media only images and stories about Israeli victims? And are we seeing on Al Jazeera and other Arab media only images of the suffering that's occurring in Gaza? Is the coverage contextual? So this is really important. Do we really understand the background? So does the coverage, for example, mention that Hamas's stated goal is the destruction of the state of Israel? Now, I'm not saying that to excuse what Hamas did, but it provides context, right? And does the coverage provide context from the Israeli standpoint? The context that Netanyahu, for example, has always opposed the two-state solution. So is that context there so that we can help to understand the motivations from each side? Not to excuse the motivations, but to understand the motivations. Are the media disseminating only verified facts? So the minute this war started, disinformation spread like a wildfire. There's an old cliche that the first casualty of war is the truth. So journalists need to be very careful about taking so-called facts and images from this war and making sure that those have been verified. In fact, media outlets on all sides have already been guilty of using old pictures and using old video from previous conflicts in their coverage of this conflict. Does the coverage stereotype, generalize, and demonize them, the other side? I think we've seen a lot of coverage that does just that. Are peace plans and proposals dismissed by the media as unworkable, unrealistic, undesirable? So in the case of Ukraine coverage, I did a study that we don't have time to talk about, but what the study basically showed is there's very little discussion about peace in Ukraine. And when there is discussion, it's quickly dismissed. This is something that just benefits Putin, so we can't discuss it. What are the consequences of the reporting? On social media, are journalists actively combating falsehoods about the war? Because there's a flood of misinformation. Is the coverage biased? Is it good guys versus bad guys? And I think you've seen a lot of that in Western media, demonizing Palestinians, and in Israeli media, so in Palestinian and Arab media, you see demonization of Israelis, and in Western media, you see demonization of Palestinians. And is the coverage sensational, both in terms of language, in terms of images? So is this language and are these images necessary to tell this story? Okay, so at this point then, what I've done is I've collected some newspaper front pages from the Israel-Hamas war. And I want us to take a look at these and sort of collectively think about whether we think these front pages represent peace journalism or not. So you look at this first screen. So what I'm asking at the top, is the coverage sensational in terms of language and images? Are bloody and horrifying images used because they're needed to tell the story? Or are they used as clickbait? are the images and storytelling emotionally exploitative? And are victims re-traumatized? So look at the picture of those three children. What if you were the father or the brother of these three children or mother? What would you think about that? Would you want your children portrayed in this way? Look at the use of the language, mutilated. Certainly not peace journalism. Look at these two. So I think the one on the left is probably okay. So it shows someone the strong emotions reacting, but I don't think it invades their privacy, especially since we can't really see their faces very well. Okay, the one on the right, I think, again, it tends to be more neutral. We need to be really careful when we show children, but I think it's probably a little bit better. So what do you think of the Evening Standard headline? I'm of two minds on this. I think that it may be intruding on a private moment, on the suffering of the woman on the left, but I think it's a powerful image that tells the story. On the right, Israeli aircraft pound Gaza ahead of major ground offensive, and again we see a child. So a child being rescued. You know, I would never say never use children, but I'm not sure about that. Look at this last one. I think all of us can agree that this is the antithesis of peace journalism. Look at the language, bloodbath. Look at the images. The image of the child, you probably can't see on your screen. But when you look at it really closely, you will see that it's been photoshopped. So that blood on the child has been photoshopped so that it's very red, so that it's a more vivid red than what we would normally have. So I think that that's very exploitative, that it's extremely, that it's really, as I say, the antithesis of peace journalism. Okay, so I'm finding my way. So then how would peace journalism treat this differently? What would we do, and how would we do it? So here's some ideas about how peace journalism could be used to cover the Israel-Hamas war. First of all, to reject making excuses for violence and marginalizing those who propose solutions. Okay, there's a term for that, colonizers journalism, that we're not going to get to today. But certainly, a peace journalist would not make excuses for anyone who's perpetrating violence. To present all survivors and their stories as worthy. A victim is a victim is a victim, whether that victim is in Ukraine or Gaza or Israel. To provide context within stories and overall. So again, keeping in mind the background, keeping in mind the motivations. Why are they doing this? So that the audience can make up their own mind as to who may be right and who may be wrong. To reject us versus them and to never demonize them. So why do I call this the Israel-Hamas war? Because the war is against Hamas. To say that all of Gaza is at war against Israel implies that all of Gaza somehow engaged in violence against Israel. And we know that this is not the case. So it's easy to find an enemy and to demonize them. Better journalism doesn't do that. To reject stereotypes and generalizations. The word all comes to mind, right? All Russians are bloodthirsty Putin supporters. I know Russians who are not either of those things. So whenever we make that generalization, we have to be very careful. And we could say the same of Israelis. Not all Israelis support the war. Not all Israelis support Netanyahu or the way that he's conducted the war. Peace journalism would meaningfully discuss peace proposals, exploring ideas for peace without reflexively dismissing these ideas, to avoid sensationalism in language and images, and to balance perspectives and avoid false equivalencies. So Israel-Gaza, here's one false equivalency. When we say that people on both sides have died, that's technically correct. But the false equivalency is that 1,200 Israelis have died and that 25,000 Gazans have died. So somehow giving a reader or viewer the impression that these two things are equivalent, I mean, they most certainly are not, right? So as I conclude then, I would say that there are certainly deficits in the coverage of this conflict, Israel-Hamas, and I might add in terms of Ukraine as well. And I think that peace journalism offers us some good suggestions, some good ideas for being more thoughtful about the coverage that we engage in. So at this point then, I see a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to take those first. If you have other questions, feel free to put those in the chat. So question, what are some good sources to follow to understand the Israeli-Hamas conflict better? This is really difficult because you really have two distinct sides to the reporting. So I do follow sources on both sides. I think that from the US that NPR, National Public Radio, is a really good source. From the Arab-Israeli side, I think that Al Jazeera does a lot of good reporting. You just have to understand that Al Jazeera is biased. They're anti-Israel. They're pro-Palestinian. But if you realize that, then that's a good start. And the same thing with coverage you see in Western media generally. The BBC has some good coverage too. Radio Free Europe has some good coverage. But understand that when you get a Western source, most likely that source is going to be pro-Israeli. About the application of peace journalism in the Gaza case. What if the sufferings on one side are much larger and significant than the other side? It's a good question. It's what we just talked about, right? So it's a false equivalency to say that the suffering has been equivalent. Okay, there's been much more suffering on one side than on the other side. But I think we need to be careful, regardless of which side we might support. I think that as peace journalism asks, that whether it's one victim or a million victims, that we treat with respect and dignity the survivor stories, regardless of where they come from. So you may be pro-Palestinian, but that doesn't mean that the media should ignore the suffering that's occurred in Israel. Okay, let's see. I've got a new one down here. Doesn't peace journalism hold objectivity hostage to the events that actually occur on the ground? Good question. So when I present peace journalism around the world, the number one criticism I get is that peace journalism is not objective. So in my textbook, Peace Journalism Principles and Practices, which I just happen to have handy here, in my textbook, I devote, I don't know, 4 or 5 pages to this. So as I said at the very beginning, peace journalism doesn't advocate for peace. So we're not saying there must be peace. We are reporting about peace, talking to peacemakers, talking to the marginalized. We are framing our stories and using language in a different way. Think about it this way. If someone tells you that they're a war correspondent, would you say, oh, you're in favor of war, you're advocating for war? Of course not. She's reporting about war, not advocating for a war. We're reporting about peace, not advocating for peace. Another way to look at this has been articulated by Dr. Jake Lynch, who you've heard me mention several times. Dr. Lynch uses the term filters, and he makes this argument that every day that a journalist uses 1,000 filters, makes 1,000 decisions about what stories to tell, who to interview, what angle to take, what words to use, what quotes to use, what video and audio to use. You get the idea, right? I mean, we make 1,000 decisions. So to these 1,000 decisions, let's add one more. What are the consequences of our reporting? So the language and the images and the framing that we use, do they pour gasoline on the fire, or are they giving peace a chance? And so to those who say that peace journalism is not objective, I respectfully disagree. So other questions?
Maybe if I could tag on to that earlier discussion. Sure. I mean, you're right that, of course, any story selection, any angle selection, is choosing one frame over another, and therefore, you can't really say that this is standard news reporting is in that sense undoubtedly objective. There is a choice of frames, right? But the one particular problem seems to be that, of course, that the way that we define news seems too biased anti-peace journalism, since if it bleeds, it leads. Conflict is valued over nothing much going on. Sudden change is valued over gradual processes. So a bomb which changes things suddenly is, by our current definitions of news, more newsworthy than some boring guys in suits somewhere in Qatar spending hours on discussions. We don't know where they're headed anywhere, right? So it does, peace journalism does require us to be much more self-critical about the standard values that we apply to news. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, what you said is absolutely true. And I really like that you used the term self-critical. It's interesting, this idea that I was taught in journalism school, that students around the world are still taught in journalism school, that it has to be bloody, if it has to be sensational for people to pay attention to it. In fact, research that's been done and published in the Peace Journalism magazine runs counter to that. So audiences in focus groups and surveys actually prefer peace journalism style stories and stories with solutions. Why? Because these stories leave them feeling more knowledgeable and feeling empowered. Traditional news leaves audiences disempowered, and in some cases, even depressed. And so this stale notion that news is news only if it bleeds is simply not true. Now, we need to get the word out and get the message out, because there's a great deal of inertia as well. So I see that Christiana has a hand raised. Please tell me your question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for this very interesting webinar. I actually written my question in my in the chat, but it doesn't matter. It has been skipped accidentally, so I will pose it here again.
I'm sorry, I didn't see it.
That's all right. So I'm joining you from Cyprus. In Cyprus, we have a conflict. It's not an active war.
If I can interrupt, I've done a peace journalism project in Cyprus with the Cyprus Community Media Network, and then did some lectures both in the south and in the north. Please continue.
Okay, maybe we can talk later on. You can join another interesting project if interested. All right, but the question is, what do we do in Cyprus where there is not active war, but we still need peace journalism? Because it's really important to support, to have journalism that is conducive to the peace effort. The Secretary General has reported many times that journalism and media in Cyprus are not helping reaching a solution. So how do we train journalists? I teach in a university in Cyprus in a program of journalism, and I'm really interested in helping journalists to overcome the boundaries of bias and other kind of discourses that limit the practice that would be conducive to peace journalism and peace efforts. Thank you.
So that's a really good question. And according to my Cypriot colleagues, and really others who are in divided societies, like Moldova, where there's a breakaway republic, then there's Moldova. So wherever there's this division, I think it's really important this is where those who train journalists, like you, I think are really important. If you made me the king of all of Cyprus, students would start learning about media literacy as very young children so that they can see the disinformation and understand it coming from both sides. Then at the high school level and at the collegiate level, everyone learns peace journalism and starts practicing peace journalism. I would love to see more cross-border, cross-boundary efforts between Greek Cypriot journalists and Turkish Cypriot journalists. So I can't speak to I can't speak to Greek Cyprus, but in Turkish Cyprus at Eastern Mediterranean University, Dr. Metin Ersoy and some of my other colleagues have a very robust peace journalism program that they run there. And I've had the privilege of, as I say, lecturing both there and through a project with the Cyprus Community Media Network. But we have a lot to talk about, so feel free to email me and we can discuss those things. In fact, before we close today, this is my contact information. My email address is there. My Twitter, or X, I guess you call it now, is @peacejournalism. It's the same on Instagram. There's also a Facebook peace journalism group that I encourage you to join. So any questions that didn't get answered today, anything else you want to know about, to get an opinion about, feel free to email me. I always answer my emails, and I look forward to hearing from you all.
If you have a bit more time, we have a few more questions. Is that all right, Steve?
Sure, I've got time for a couple. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is 𝗬𝗲𝗃𝗲, and I'm a PhD candidate here.
Could you speak up a little bit? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Could you hear me now?
Better.
All right. So my name is 𝗬𝗲𝗃𝗲, and I am a PhD candidate here. And earlier, very kindly, I was reminded by Professor 𝗬𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃 that you have been a journalist and you might have a few things to say about use of photographs, which is very apt. Because when you showed the photo of Evening Standard, if I'm not wrong, there was a photograph on the left-hand side of your slide and it was a coverage on Evening Standard, Evening Standard. My question to you is, as you rightly mentioned earlier, that most of the things in our life is not as black and white as we would like to have it. There are some gray areas. Yes, that Evening Standard photograph. So when we apply your idea of peace journalism as a researcher, all of a sudden, all the work that have been done by Pulitzer Prize winning journalists showing photographs that might appear as gory, the way you conceptualized, where do we leave that kind of journalism? Because what you're saying is that when you're selecting pictures, and I'm not talking about words, but especially with selection of pictures, and if we have to analyze pictures as researchers, let's put words aside. But what is the take of peace journalism when analyzing pictures? How do we define what is peace, or what is the approach of peace, or whether because a photograph can invoke different emotions? That is one. The second question I had was, when you gave an example of a war correspondent, you said when we say a war correspondent, it doesn't mean the person is sort of propagating war, right? They are covering war. Similarly, when you say peace journalism, we are not necessarily promoting peace. But throughout the presentation, there is an assumption that the role of journalists is to promote peace. So I see there's a bit of a contradiction in what you said in those two examples, if I'm not wrong.
So you've given me a lot to talk about. So again, I would say, and if you email me, I'll send you the portion of my chapter that talks about objectivity. Look, I know that the term peace is inflammatory. I devote a few pages in my book on that too. So the very idea of peace is inflammatory and creates all sorts of images in terms of subjectivity versus objectivity. I would just repeat what I said earlier, that I think that any idea that journalists are completely objective is fantasy. So objectivity may be a desirable goal, but it's fantasy to suggest that journalism or journalists are objective. And so it's simply another decision or several decisions that we're making every day, subjective decisions that we're making about our news. So if you think that renders it suddenly not objective, I would tell you, I don't think it was objective in the first place. In terms of selecting images, I would never say, don't use a bloody image. So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we need to be really careful about why we're using that image, about the consequences of the use of that image, and to look into our own motivations with regard to our use of that image. Are we using it as clickbait? Are we using it because it's sensational? Or is it absolutely necessary to tell the story? So the day after 9/11 in the United States, journalism organizations, well, not just in the US, but journalism organizations around the world had 1 million images to choose from. And many of those images they decided not to use. For example, one that's called Falling Man, and it's a body, a person who's jumped out of a window at the World Trade Center. So where is it that you draw that line? There's a line somewhere. And I wish I could tell you exactly what it is. But certainly there have been content analysis studies of images in peace journalism that I think a Google Scholar search should turn those up straight away. All right, Professor.
I have a question that I want to draw attention to Arjun's last question.
Go on ahead. Final question, please, because I need to run.
Of course. That geopolitics steer global newsroom agendas, and of course that limits what journalists can do. I want to tag onto that what I've read about many peace journalism trainings that seem to work uniformly while the project is going on, But then these journalists who have discovered these new ways of doing the news find that they enter newsrooms that are unreformed, right? Have to deal with editors who are dealing with old ways, and then you're back to square one. How do you have ideas on how you can address that, the resistance from editors?
Right. Well, one way we address that is by training editors. So I've done dozens and dozens of trainings with editors. You know, something else I suggest to my trainees, and I've had hundreds of them in all sorts of different situations. Well, let me just back up for a second. So no matter where you are, whether it's the US or mainland China or Uganda, where I worked for a year, there are impediments to peace journalism. In the US, the impediments are largely economic. In a place like Uganda, the impediment, one of the chief impediments is that many radio stations, radio is the most popular medium, many radio stations are owned by politicians. I've done peace journalism seminars by Zoom for mainland Chinese journalists. And so how much of this peace journalism they can accomplish depends on what the obstacles are. So we know in mainland China that this sort of holding government accountable watchdog kind of journalism, you know, that's looking at true balance, that's not going to be possible. So when I talked to my colleagues in mainland China, I showed them the 10 principles. And I said, well, which one of these can you practice? And they pointed out several of them: to consider the consequences of their reporting, to not make angry people angrier by using inflammatory language, by giving a voice to marginalized people. So even in the most restrictive environments, some of these things can be accomplished. And so that would apply to situations where editors might be hostile to peace journalism. So there's nowhere I know of that all 10 of those principles can be practiced. But there's also nowhere that I know of where at least a few of them can't be practiced. And I think if you do practice at least a few of these, that you've become a better journalist.
Thank you very much. And let me just invite everyone in the room and online to show our thanks in the usual way. Thank you.